Mr. President, first I ask unanimous consent that John Vesey, a congressional fellow in my office, be granted privileges of the floor for the duration of the debate on S-3268.
Without objection.
Mr. President, here is the situation we find ourselves in with respect to oil. Global supplies are tight, global demand keeps rising, and our country has a dangerous dependence that we haven't yet begun to break. Meanwhile, the Bush administration has run up massive budget deficits, instigated by a war in Iraq that is costing us $5,000 per second, tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans that could cost more than $4 trillion before the next decade is out. And that's caused the value of the dollar to drop and investors to buy more commodities like oil. The oil futures market used to be primarily a place for companies to pay in advance for oil supplies they knew that they'd need, but now the futures market is overcome with runaway speculation, with people buying futures just because they're betting that the price will go up. Some experts say that speculation is adding as much as 50% to the cost of every barrel. With oil prices this high, oil companies are raking in record profits, sums of money that are bigger than the GDP of some countries. But instead of reinvesting that money in their business and in renewable energy possibilities and expanding production to meet our country's growing needs, oil companies are investing in their own share price by buying back their own stock. That may be good news for Wall Street, but it is bad news for anyone struggling to pay to fill up their gas tank. So that's how we've gotten to $140 a barrel oil. Tight supply, high dependency and demand, a Bush budget deficit that is weakening the dollar, oil is traded in dollars, speculation in the market, and oil companies' greater concern for boosting their share price than for boosting production. Now, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have suggested that all it would take to bring down oil prices would be to allow oil companies to drill off the east and west coasts of the United States. That's all it would take. Now, here's the problem with that. Companies already have, as we've said before on the floor, 68 million acres of federal land under lease that they are largely not exploiting. The federal government will be opening up 2.3 million additional acres to them in October. And they have over 200 million more acres that they don't lease, but they could if they wanted to. The oil companies clearly think there's oil on all those millions of acres, or else they wouldn't be leasing the land. But they aren't using it. Now, just to get an idea of the scale that is involved, here is a map showing how much territory the oil companies control in the Gulf of Mexico. The red represents all of those unused acres. It is a huge portion of the Gulf region going completely undeveloped. That's been available to them already. Yet, all of those red areas go undeveloped. And here's an even more maybe impressive map, the map of how much of the western United States oil companies control. The black portions show where oil companies are exploring, and again, the red sections show where they are not exploring, and as you can see, it's overwhelmingly staggering of all of those red sections of places that they already have the ability to pursue that they are simply not pursuing. The oil companies control an enormous amount of land, When you add it all up, it's an area more than 12 times the size of my home state of New Jersey. So why would signing up over yet more land to them have any effect at all? Now, it isn't that companies don't have enough land to drill on. That's not the bottleneck. The bottleneck is that for 20 years, oil companies have been underinvesting in oil exploration and in the infrastructure, the equipment, and even the engineers needed to do much of the additional drilling. Here's what the CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, which is the trade organization representing all of these companies, said last month. He said, quote, "Every single available drilling rig, drilling ship is in use, being used right now. You can't go and drill when you don't have equipment. We are not magicians as an industry." Close quote. Well, so all of this clamor for more land doesn't do anything about that reality. For all of this land, this water rights, for all of these land rights, all of that doesn't even deal with that. So if we give them even one more acre, what would it mean? That's part of why it would take so long, as long as a decade, to get to the first drop of oil from the outer continental shelf. Even if we wanted to, if we thought it was good policy, which I do not, the capacity just isn't there. There's a reason they don't have the equipment to drill more, and that's simply that they're not reinvesting in their own businesses, they're just investing in their own stock. Last year, ExxonMobil spent about $21 billion in capital expenditures, such as buying new equipment, compared to more than $35 billion that it gave to its stockholders. And what we see here in this chart is that, in fact, the billions of dollars of big oil stock buybacks in 2002 to 2007, where it has increased over 5 times what it was just 6 years ago. So the reality is we have a lot of money from big oil going back into big oil stocks, rising the value of those stocks, but doing nothing about all the things that the CEO of the American Petroleum Institute talked about. In the first quarter of this year, with oil prices sky high, ExxonMobil decided to spend almost $9 billion on stock buybacks alone. $9 billion in the first quarter. They spent almost a full 40% less on actually exploring for oil. The situation is even more extreme at ConocoPhillips, which told its investors that stock buybacks this quarter will come to about $2.5 billion, 9 times its budget for exploration. On the whole, the 5 biggest international oil companies used more than half of the cash they made from their businesses into stock buybacks and dividends last year, up from just 1% in the early 1990s. An expert at Rice University who studies how oil companies spend their money summed it up very well. She said, quote, "If you're not spending your money finding and developing new oil, then there's no new oil." There's a very simple economic reality here. While families are struggling to make ends meet, the oil companies are flush with cash. And we have seen big oil profits steadily increasing under this administration. You know, from approximately $22 or so billion in 2002 to nearly $120 billion in 2007. That's about $100 billion more. There's a very simple economic reality here. Families are struggling to make ends meet, but the oil companies are flush with cash. And instead of investing in the new equipment that they say that they need to pursue the land they want, they're giving themselves a big payback. and plowing their cash back into their own stocks. At some point, oil companies need to recognize that they have been trusted to manage natural resources from public lands, and there are times when they have a responsibility greater than just boosting their bottom line. With gas and food prices through the roof and the economy sputtering, we have arrived at that point long ago. So when people say we need to drill more, I say tell it to the oil companies. Tell them to use their profits to invest in more equipment. Drill in the 68 million acres they already have leased. Basically, when oil companies say that giving them more acreage would increase the amount of oil they produce, it's like saying if your car is about to run out of gas, you need to pull over and install a bigger tank. The problem in that situation isn't the size of the tank. And the problem we face right now isn't that oil companies don't have enough land to drill on. The problem is they're not drilling on what they have. Not to mention, even if offshore drilling produced every drop that optimists are talking about, it wouldn't even be close enough to affect gas prices one way or another. Even President Bush's own Energy Information Administration admits that all we're talking about is a drop in the bucket that will have no effect whatsoever on the price at the pump. And let me put offshore production in perspective. This is what our colleagues say is the panacea, the solution to everything. Really misleading, I hate to say, because the way you hear them say this, you think that we drill tomorrow, open up these new lands along our outer continental shelves on the east and west coast, and guess what spurts right up? Let this happen tomorrow and you get gasoline in your tank for a lot less. I think the American public understands much better than that. It understands that it takes a decade before we see the first drop. It understands that it takes until the year 2030. Talk about we need relief now, not in the year 2030. And even then, what do we get? Since April, Americans have responded to record high gas prices by using over 800,000 barrels a day less. 800,000 barrels a day less than we did 1 year ago. This is the most significant and sudden drop in oil demand since the 1970s. But what's happened, notwithstanding the fact that we've reduced demand by 800,000 barrels a day, since April, we continue to see record gas prices. Prices go up. In recent weeks, Saudi Arabia has increased their production by 500,000 barrels every day. And what happened? Gas prices continue to go up. So how is it that if we had 800,000 barrels a day in reduced demand, gas prices went up, 500,000 barrels a day in new production by Saudi Arabia, a combination of 1.3 million barrels a day, how does the Bush-McCain drilling plan compare to these recent events so that prices have gone up, notwithstanding that shift of 1.3 million barrels a day? If we open all of our shores and risk all of our tourism, fishing industries, and all of the economies of all of the coastal states to oil production, the first drop of oil wouldn't be seen until the year 2017. And oil production would peak in the year 2030. And what would we get in the year 2030? We'd get 200,000 barrels a day. Well, my God, if a reduction of 800,000 barrels a day has done nothing and gas prices went up, if the Saudis pumping out 500,000 new barrels a day and prices go up, how is it that getting 200,000 barrels a day in the year 2030 is going to reduce gas prices tomorrow? It is a sham being created by those who want another grab for their oil company friends, as we have seen over the last 7 years by the two oil men in the White House. To put that number another way, the amount of gas we could get from offshore drilling is equivalent to a few tablespoons per car per day. Together, an 800,000 barrel per day reduction in demand, an increase of 500,000 barrels per day of Saudi production equals that 1.3 million barrels per day shift in the market. And yet we still have record gas prices. So if this massive shift has no impact, it's clear that the production of 200,000 barrels a day in the year 2030 will do absolutely nothing at all about gas prices today. It is simply wrong to think that opening up offshore drilling will lower gas prices. So, one might ask, why are oil companies asking us to hand over more land when they already have so much that is unused? And it seems to me there's only one explanation, Mr. President. Oil companies aren't actually in a rush to drill in those areas, but they are in a rush to control as much federal land as possible before their friends in the Bush administration leave office. The oil company's strategy right now is to grab control of as much federal land and water possible before January 20th of 2009, the date that the next president of the United States takes office. They're trying to take advantage of the current energy crisis to take control of more public property and boost their profits. And the GOP plan to open our shores to drilling isn't only about oil prices, believe me, it is really about share prices. And that plan comes with a serious price tag, a vast increase in the risks to the health of our coasts and the economies that they support. You know, sometimes, if you go to the archives building on its portal here in Washington, it says what is past is prologue. And I would remind Americans of some of these facts. We were all told that we had the most advanced tankers in the world and that they would prevent any spills from happening. But we all also, I hope, remember the devastation off the coast of Alaska after the crash of the Exxon Valdez. We all remember that after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, there was, yes, a human tragedy, and there was also an economic tragedy. There was an environmental tragedy off the Gulf Coast. I've read comments by some who say that, oh, nothing happened. Look at that. The infrastructure and the technology is so advanced. We didn't get one drop of spillage after Hurricane Katrina and Rita. Wrong. False. 700,000 gallons of oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico, and over 7 million gallons of oil leaked offshore from the infrastructure that supports offshore drilling. Now, I don't know, and here's a picture. This is not my picture, Mr. President. This is a picture from the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard. And what did they do to try to deal with that oil that leaked? They burned it to try to dissipate it. Now, if I saw this off the New Jersey shore, or North Carolina, or Florida, or California, or Oregon, or Washington, I'd say that's a major disaster. And yet we have colleagues here saying, not a drop fell. False, wrong, not true. Between commercial fishing, sport fishing, forestry, and tourism, drilling would pose a threat to coastal economies that are over $200 billion a year. That's how much our coastal economies generate along the east and west coast, over $200 billion a year. And that's part of what led President Bush's father to declare when he was president, when he put in place the moratorium on offshore drilling. He said then, as first President Bush, he said, quote, certain areas of our coasts represent unique natural resources. In those areas, even the small risk posed by oil and gas development may be too great. Now, I don't consider this, Mr. President, nor do I, where's the man in the suits? Nor do I consider this type of contamination a small risk. But even the first President Bush said, even those risks posed by oil and gas development may be too great. Even what he considered small risks were too great. This is far beyond small risks. It's what led President Bush's brother Jeb, the former governor of Florida, to say, protection of those resources is of paramount importance to the state of Florida. Now, those Bushes got it straight. They understood. In my home state of New Jersey, we cannot escape those risks when drilling would happen less than 100 miles off of our shores. The New Jersey shore generates tens of billions of dollars in revenues each year, and it supports about 500,000 jobs. We've already seen in the past the devastating economic effects of medical waste washing up on our beaches. New Jersey families and businesses cannot afford the risk of an oil slick on the scale of the Exxon Valdez crash or the spills after hurricanes Katrina and Rita, with sticky crude forcing beaches to close, killing wildlife, collapsing property values, and destroying our economy in the process. Mr. President, we need real barrels coming out of the ground, not paper barrels filling nothing but big oil's balance sheets. It's time to take action to shore up our energy security and drive down the price of gasoline. First, we need to take action to lower gas prices now. The federal government should release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to provide immediate relief. We can have a swap where we can take the light crude. We can actually, in fact, make money on this and get the type of crude that we need, and at the same time help try to affect the price by having that immediate surge of oil into the marketplace. In addition, I've joined together with Senators Feingold and Dodd to introduce the Responsible Federal Oil and Gas Lease Act, which requires oil companies to show that they are either producing oil or gas on public lands or making progress exploring or developing them on current leases before they get their hands on more land when they're not even producing on that which they have. We've also introduced the Responsible Ownership of Public Land Act, along with Senator Durbin. The bill would charge oil companies a fee for every acre of land they lease but fail to use for production. In combination, these measures could give oil companies the incentives they need to get barrels of oil out of their balance sheets and onto the marketplace. In addition, I'll be offering an amendment to make sure that oil that is produced on land owned by the people of the United States gets used by the people of the United States. Right now, oil companies ship 1.5 million barrels per day of domestically produced oil overseas. 1.5 million barrels a day produced in the lands and waters of the United States, shipped overseas. Last year, that meant over 500,000 barrels of oil per year was taken from U.S. public lands and sent abroad. Now, we're talking about using the Outer Continental Shelf and getting 200,000 barrels in the year 2030. Well, we've been sending over 1.5 million barrels a day to other places in the world. Oil that comes from public lands. If we're going to endanger our own environment and deplete our own resources, certainly we should be the ones who should benefit from it. Not that I believe that that should be the case, but in terms of taking a risk for our own lands and public resources, certainly not to drill off the coast, but to the extent that we have drilling going on now and we have land that they are not drilling on, that ultimate production should come here in the United States. Over 500,000 barrels sent abroad. We need to bring medium and long-term relief so that the energy crisis like this doesn't happen again. And that moves us to the ultimate goal, Mr. President. This country should be far more aspirational in its view of this issue. We should approve the renewable energy tax extensions bill that our colleagues on the Republican side have opposed, that would help continue the rapid growth of wind and solar and provide an incentive for the purchase of plug-in hybrid vehicles. This will help us begin the transition to new energy sources so we are not so vulnerable to the rising costs of fossil fuels, not to mention what it does to our environment and global warming. We should clamp down on rampant oil speculation and burst the speculative bubble that has caused oil prices to skyrocket. And we should be acting now on global climate change legislation that lays out the framework to completely change our economy from one that is based on oil and other fossil fuels to an economy based on renewable energy. That's a real plan, not just a plan to go out in search of our next oil fix. Mr. President, increasing the share of oil that we produce here at home is important, and we should make sure there are incentives for oil companies to produce, but authorizing drilling in the outer continental shelf would just be a distraction, would do nothing to bring down gas prices now or ever. Drivers are calling out for us to bring down gas prices, not to prop up oil company stocks. Our government needs to stop holding the oil companies' hand and start holding them accountable. American families and businesses deserve a government that works for them, not just for the people who sell us our oil. A mother can't fill up the family car with the predictions in oil companies' annual reports. A business can't ship its products with so-called likely reserves. What makes the engine of our economy run today is what comes out of the ground, not what's written on paper. And what will make our economy run tomorrow is our ability to transition beyond this addiction. Making a major commitment to create the economy of the future, free from the liquid shackles of oil, would send a clear message to the world that America is ready to lead again. That's the message we should be sending. We have to ask ourselves, since when have we been a country that is afraid of a challenge? Since when have we waited for others to innovate, waited for others to rescue us from the dangers we face, waited for other nations to take the lead? When we entered the Second World War, our allies knew we were in it with our hearts and souls. When President Kennedy announced that we would go to the moon, friend and foe alike knew that we would not rest until we had allowed mankind to take that giant step. I refuse to believe that a country responsible for the light bulb, the telephone, and the computer can't decide to become a country powered by wind turbines, solar cells, and geothermal plants. There's no reason we can't decide to move towards pioneering our nation with innovative, clean energy, especially since we have the technology to get started. Mr. President, 2 Americans were the first to fly. As one engineer said at the time, the Wright brothers flew right through the smoke screen of impossibility. It's time we showed we believed ending this energy crisis is incredibly possible. If we want to bring down the sky-high price of oil, stop shipping our money overseas in exchange for foreign oil, and make our economy soar again, then it's time we did everything we can to get a real program for energy independence off the ground. That is our real challenge. That is our real opportunity. That should be our real mission. And so, Mr. President, I close once again by saying this comment about offshore drilling, that's the way we're going to solve all our problems. 800,000 barrels reduction in demand, prices went up. 500,000 barrels more production by the Saudi, gas prices went up. 1.3 million barrels and change, prices went up. 68 million acres of land the oil companies have they don't use. Another reason prices go up, restricted demand. So the bottom line is, let us move forward in a way that meets our challenge not only today but tomorrow. We are a country that can do. We are a country of infinite possibility. It's time to go beyond the short-sighted, narrow view that in fact we must risk all of our coastal economies, $200 billion a year, for something that won't produce one drop of oil for a decade, won't receive full production until 2030 and won't do anything now or in the future about reducing gas prices, but will ultimately say to future generations of Americans that we, in the expediency of the moment, we're willing to risk not only those economies, but the natural resources of this country for something that would do absolutely nothing about gas prices. We can do better than that, Mr. President. That's what this debate is all about, and that's the opportunity we have. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.